Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Sorry for the delay in the video. I've had a few things come up and it took me a little longer than it usually does to come up with another video, but I'm glad to get back to Princess Elizabeth and the Duchess and the Duke and everybody and see what's going on since the last time we saw them. So, when we last left the Duke and Duchess of York, they were greeted warmly by their family and the people of England, and Princess Elizabeth was happy to see them too. Well, King George was going through a rough time and almost died. Prince David was called home thinking the king was going to die. The king wasn't too happy thinking that Prince David was going to be on the throne. He told Elizabeth and the Duke of York that David would never be king. Elizabeth and her husband didn't believe it. They would soon come to realize that the king was right. The good news is that we found out Elizabeth was pregnant again, and let's go back and visit the Queen Mother's book and see what happens next. Princess Elizabeth said it had been 4 years since little Elizabeth arrived, and that she had forgotten what it was like. She and the Duke felt like their second child should be born at Glamis, and in mid-July, a few weeks before the baby was due, they went there. The weather was great, and the Duchess enjoyed sitting in the sun, waiting to give birth. She had a feeling that she was going to have a girl again. She wrote the Queen on July 21st and said, "I will write again soon and only hope that our new daughter will not delay too long after August the 8th. By the end of July, the weather had turned wet and the Duchess was getting irritable waiting. She wanted the whole business to be over with. The remoteness of Scotland seemed to be a disadvantage. She thought if she had another baby, she would have it in London and during the wintertime. August 21st, the Duchess had her second daughter, and she was in labor for 6 hours. It was an easier birth than it had been with Elizabeth. The news was telephoned to the King and Queen. The Queen's reaction was to be sorry it was not a boy, but the King said he was glad it was a girl, and one could play with girls longer than with boys, and the parents were young and had plenty of time to have a son. Queen Mary was glad to hear the King's response, and she sent congratulations to her son. The Queen was wondering how little Elizabeth would take the birth of her sister, and she was enchanted by her. Princess Elizabeth first thought that her sister was a doll, and then found out she was alive. And then she took each of the 3 doctors by the hand and said, "I want to introduce you to my baby sister." In London, the bells of St. Paul rang in salute, and the Tower of London fired a 21-gun salute. At Glamis, they had a large bonfire. The Duke said to the Duchess that he didn't mind at all that it was a girl. He said he would have liked a boy and that he knew Elizabeth would have too, but Lilibet now had a playmate in the nursery, and he told her that they had plenty of time because they were still young. The family was having trouble with a name for the new princess. The Duke and Duchess wanted to call her Anne, but the King didn't like that name for some reason. He wanted her to be called Margaret, after Margaret of Scotland, our ancestress. The Duchess told the Queen that she was very anxious to call her Anne Margaret, because she thought Anne of York sounded pretty, and Elizabeth and Anne go so well together. She wondered what she thought. She said lots of people suggested Margaret, but it had no family links really on either side, and besides, she would always be getting mixed up with Margaret the nursery maid. Well, the King and Queen weren't buying that, and the Yorks reluctantly agreed to call their daughter Margaret Rose instead of Margaret Anne. The Duchess wrote, "I hope you will like it," and the King and Queen did. The Duke took Elizabeth to Balmoral, and he wrote a letter to Elizabeth. And from Lilibet, she had a letter that she dictated to him, and it said, "Darling Mummy, I miss you very much. I came over the Devil's Elbow, and we stopped twice on the way and arrived here safely at 4:30. Granny and Grandpa were pleased to see me, and I fed Snip at tea with biscuits. And Papa came to see me in my bath and put me to bed in my big little bed. It has no sides, and I'm very quiet in it." The Duke said she was proud of her bed. In her own hand, Lilibet sent a page of penciled kisses, half for Mummy and the rest for our new baby. The Duchess wrote the Duke that it was such a lovely day. "I do wish you were here, Ducky." She said she had thought of an exercise for him when he returned to Glamis. He could lug her around in the garden in a bath chair. "I miss you horribly." And the Duke sent another letter from Lilibet to the Duchess, and it said, "My darling Mummy, I'm looking forward to coming on Saturday to see my Mummy and my baby. I have been missing my Mummy very much indeed. I drove in the carriage to the gates of Birk Hall, but we did not go in. It's been raining all day, and I walked in the puddles this afternoon. Best love to Mummy and baby Margaret Rose. Your very loving daughter, Lilibet. On October 30th, Princess Margaret was christened. And in November, the Duchess felt strong enough to resume her public engagements. By Christmas Eve, they went up to Sandringham, and the family celebrated with Christmas tree and presents, and the children loved their toys. Queen Mary wrote that Princess Margaret was very composed and sweet. Christmas Day, according to their traditions, they had church in the morning, presents to the servants after lunch, and after tea they went to the ballroom where the children played. Over the rest of the holiday, the Queen, the Duchess, and the Princess Elizabeth amused themselves by having dancing lessons in the ballroom. When 1931 started out wrong for the King, his eldest sister, the Princess Royal, died, and he wrote in his diary he felt depressed. 2 weeks earlier, his oldest friend, Sir Charles Cust, died. He was an equerry for almost 40 years. And during the economic crisis of 1931, the King offered the Yorks the use of the Royal Lodge, a house in Windsor Great Park. This was a welcome offer because the Duke had given up his horses. They no longer rented houses in Hun country. Royal Lodge changed their lives, and it became one of the places the Duchess loved and lived in the most for decades to come. She died there 71 years later. Royal Lodge had been the country home of the Prince Regent, later King George IV. He didn't want to live at Windsor Castle, where his father George III was confined with sickness and delusion, and where Queen Margaret and her daughters also lived. It was called the Cottage, and it became a favorite residence. And even after he became king in 1820, he continued to use it. Queen Mary was practical, and she at first opposed her son and daughter-in-law taking on the property. She told her son that the house was very small, the garden was expensive to keep up, they would be expected to contribute to all the Windsor charities, and they would need a caretaker. And she thought they might not be able to afford it. The Duke and Duchess looked past the things that needed to be redone, and like George IV, who was always a favorite of the Duchess, as she called him Old Naughty, they loved the house right away. The Duchess wrote the Queen that they thought the place was delightful and the garden quite enchanting, and also they liked the little wood. And she said that there wasn't enough bedrooms for the four of them, but they could manage it if her husband took one of the small downstairs rooms as his dressing room. She said it would be wonderful for the children, and I'm sure that they would be very happy there. The Duchess said she knew it would take money, but she thought that they could manage. Well, Queen Mary, once she knew that they were serious, got in on the project, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. They took out the partitions in the big saloon and restored it to its glory, and the floor was in bad condition, so they put down parquet. They changed the old kitchen and turned it into a dining room, and they moved the kitchen towards the back of the house. The Duchess thought it would cut down on the smell of cooking around the house, and that would have the staff more self-contained in that back area. They decided to demolish the enormous conservatory and build a new family wing. They found builders who would do it, and it was by the Duke's own designs. They would have an all-new bathroom and other fittings for a little over £5,000, and they would pay for the work themselves. By the end of 1932, the gloomy, run-down house was transformed into a charming and comfortable home. They wanted Royal Lodge to be their real home, where they could relax, and they wanted to have love and laughter there, and above all, have a home where their children might grow up with the boon and the blessing of a family life with affection and understanding, just like the Duchess had known growing up, and that the Duke had never experienced. The garden was as important as the house. It was the Duchess's first chance at gardening. She had learned it from her mother, and the Duke had a chance to develop his talent for landscaping. He liked to be out in all weathers, dressed in blue overalls and a double-edged javelin chopper, clippers, and a saw, and he was followed by a small army of household servants. They ended up creating one of the most beautiful smaller gardens in the country. They replanted and extended the existing garden, bringing in a waterfall and a series of pools to enlarge the rock garden. The Duke loved the rhododendrons, and the Duchess had a special affection for the magnolias. The Duchess hired a soldier named Ernest Pierce, who had been a convalescent soldier at Glamis during the war. He was unemployed, and he remained at Royal Lodge until his death in 1969. There was also a miniature garden for the thatched and fully furnished house called Y Bathwyn Bach. The people of Wales presented to the Princess Elizabeth on her 6th birthday in 1932, and it still stands today. The two princesses were given the job of looking after the garden there. So I'm going to stop the video here. King George went through his health scare and lost not only his sister, but some friends as well. So he's going through a rough time. He got past it, and he had the love of his family for support. Princess Margaret entered into the world, and the Duchess was happy that the birth was easier than the one she had the first time around. There was a bit of a family disagreement as to what to name the second child. The Duke and Duchess wanted to name her Anne, but King George didn't like that name. Then they decided to name her Margaret Rose, and everyone was happy. I loved how close the family was to each other, and when the Duchess was recuperating, the Duke took Elizabeth with him to see his parents. And while they were there, the Duke wrote a letter to Elizabeth, and then had a letter that he wrote from Elizabeth, little Princess Elizabeth, and she had dictated it to him, and she was 4 years old at the time. It was sweet. So the Duke and Duchess found a place to call their own Royal Lodge. It had to be redone, but they did it and made it their home. It's been great to see the world that the Duke and Duchess lived in back then, and to see how Princess Elizabeth was back then. She had a great personality at that young age, and her loving parents made her the queen that she would become later on. Well, tune in again soon for another video from the book Queen Mother, and I wish everybody a good day. I hope everybody is doing well, and be sure to subscribe and give the videos a like if you enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.